On the 4th of July 1942, the city of Sevastopol in southwest Crimea fell to the eastward advance of Germany into the Soviet Union. It was the culmination of an 8-month-long siege and one of the bloodiest engagements of the Second World War. By the time it ended, approximately 250,000 men were either deceased or seriously wounded. But what is curious about the engagement is how seldom it features in the broader historical narrative of the Second World War. Here we tell the story of the Siege of Sevastopol, a battle which some have dubbed Hell on Earth. The Siege of Sevastopol was undertaken as part of the wider drive into the Soviet Union, which commenced with Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1941. The German invasion was three-pronged and involved approximately 3 million soldiers and personnel and thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and planes. One wave of the attack moved northeastwards towards Leningrad and a second towards the Soviet capital. These were the two initial priorities for Adolf Hitler and the German High Command. They believed the two foremost cities of Russia could be quickly captured in the winter of 1941. It would force the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, to seek peace terms quickly, and much of Eastern Europe would come under Nazi rule. However, the third prong of the German attack was more strategic. This was much further to the south through Ukraine, moving on towards the city of Stalingrad, where the Nazis would have access to massive Russian oil reserves in the Caucasus if they secured the region. On the way, they would need to secure control of the Crimean Peninsula and other key regions, including naval control of the Black Sea. In the winter and spring of 1942, the conflict on the southern prong of the German advance into Russia centered on the Crimean Peninsula. It would be overseen here by General Erich von Manstein, who was promoted to command the German 11th Army when its previous commander was killed in a plane crash. The previous commander had been preparing for an assault on the Crimean Peninsula by seizing the key port city of Sevastopol. This task was now handed over to von Manstein upon his arrival in October 1941. He quickly sent his forces, numbering over 200,000, along with a major division of Romanian troops into the peninsula. They would remain there for 8 long months in a battle that would soon extend across the Crimean Peninsula as the Soviets attempted a counterattack in the east. The initial German assault on Sevastopol in the winter of 1941 was impeded by a lack of air support. Most of Germany's aerial power was being concentrated on the northern prong attacks at this stage. Despite this, by the end of 1941, most of the Crimean Peninsula was occupied by von Manstein's forces. Sevastopol was the only major site that could still hold out at this stage. Its ability to do so was partly due to the onset of the Russian winter, which severely stalled the German advance further to the north and allowed Stalin and his generals to divert larger numbers of troops to the south. Moreover, von Manstein's plans for capturing the city were further delayed by the onset of severe rains, which delayed the German attack on the Crimean city. Thus, it was not until mid-December 1941 that a major assault on the city was launched. When the Germans finally began the assault on Sevastopol on the 17th of December, it was interrupted almost immediately by a major Russian counter-offensive when an amphibious expedition arrived to the east. This eventually involved over 500,000 Soviet troops, most of whom died or were wounded in one of the bloodiest engagements of the Second World War. Over the next several months, as von Manstein's forces sought to expel the Russians and the Russians aimed to reclaim Crimea, the Nazi forces killed approximately 6 Soviet soldiers for every German or Romanian that died. The death toll in Sevastopol, which remained under siege throughout this time, was also catastrophic, with disease, starvation, and artillery and aerial bombardment claiming thousands of lives a day during the worst engagement. Moreover, the Einsatzgruppen, divisions of SS troops who operated behind the front lines of the German army, were also in operation here and were exterminating Jewish, Romani, and other populations across the Crimean Peninsula in the winter of 1941. In the following months, the battle for the beachhead on the eastern side of the peninsula and for Sevastopol on the southwestern extremity became intertwined. Sevastopol was only be able to hold out against the Germans for so long, because von Manstein's forces were diverted away from it to fight the Russian counterattack in the east. By the end of the spring, the Russian position in the east was so critical that in his Wolf's Lair in Poland, Hitler finally acquiesced to von Manstein's long-standing request for aerial support to end the Crimean campaign. And so it went. In the first days of May 1942, over 700 planes of the German 8th Air Corps arrived in Crimea. With 1,300 sorties a day on average, the air power proved to be decisive. Von Manstein's troops finally secured the eastern beachhead on the 19th of May. Then, with the support of the 8th Air Corps and the Germans able to concentrate their attention on Sevastopol in the following weeks, the Crimean city became a charry inferno. By the time the Germans entered it on the 4th of July 1942, little of the city was left intact. The end of the siege of Sevastopol and the wider Crimean campaign ushered in a whole new stage of the war on the Eastern Front. By now, the advance on Moscow and Leningrad had stalled, and the Germans were being pushed backward out of the Soviet capital. But their focus was increasingly on securing Stalingrad, the key city dominating Russia's control of the oil fields of the Caucasus. There, in the months that followed the capture of Sevastopol, the ultimate conflict between the Germans and the Russians would ensue. When it eventually ended in the first weeks of 1943 in utter German defeat, it completely turned the tide of the war.